everyone. Welcome to the Psychology and Spirituality, a Bridge to a Better Life discussion. I'm your host, Marcia Trajano, and with me today is Peter Hays. Peter is the president of the Spiritist group, Love and Light in Newark, New Jersey, and he returns to our program today. It is such an honor to be here with you, Peter. Your
Thank you.
background includes lectures, discussions, as well as participation in different symposia, conferences, etc. And you always come, Peter, with this goal to bring light to concepts that are found in Spiritism. So, in addition to doing all of this, you have contributed, right, Peter, to, I believe, over 60 episodes of the radio program Living Spring on Kardec Radio. Check it out for all of you who have not heard it. And you're also um, contributed as an part of the editorial staff for the Spirits book that was conducted by the U.S. Spiritist Federation.
Mhm.
Today, you, Peter, are serving in the board of directors of the organization U.S. Spiritist Federation, and you're also a very active participant in the Tri-State Spiritist Federation. I just want to say thank you, Peter, for all that you do.
Well,
But
thank you, Marcia, for having me here. It's always a
uh,
pleasure to be.
Absolutely, absolutely. But let's say if you are tuning in and this is the first time that you're watching this podcast-like program, please note this program, the Psychology and Spirituality Weekly Talks, are based on the works by Joanna de Angelis. And we're going to be discussing, right, Peter, today, some concepts that she, the spiritual author, brought to us. And this discussion just offer what we are hoping to be a very safe space to really confront, to compare, and even correlate certain notions of our concepts of spirituality from a psychological lens, right? So we have spiritual concepts, but we're going to bring that psychological lens so that we can take away with us today some insights and tips and maybe even some real world advice so that we all can have a better life. And today's episode, of course, is brought to you by our friends at Spiritus Group Love and Light. So thank you. To know more about that organization, visit them at loveandlightnj.org. The overall program is sponsored by four organizations: AME Brazil, the TV Mansão do Caminho, the International Spiritist Council, and the United States Spiritist Federation. Make sure you hit subscribe if you haven't done so, and please check us out by going to the link spiritist.us for more information. Also, if you have any questions, comments, feedback, please put in the chat window so that we can better align with your expectations or your reactions to this conversation. But Peter, we are here today to bring this very interesting concept of psychological liberation, right? It's a very, for me, quite intricate notion because we're talking about liberation, freedom, psychologically speaking,
Mm.
as it is juxtaposed with a very difficult concept, right? Which is pain. So, with that, Peter, I wanted to say, have you watched that 2004 quite controversial movie, The Passion of the Christ? Have you seen it?
Yes, I have. Um, it's been a little bit of time since I saw the movie, but one of the things I remember rather vividly about it is that it's very difficult to watch. I mean, it really emphasizes the pain that
Yes.
Jesus went through in the Passion. There are moments of torture in it, and the 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 horror of it is rather graphic at times. So
Hmm.
the movie can be difficult to experience that in that regard. Um, but I think one of the questions it's asking us is when we think about psychological liberation, is there a connection between pain or difficulties that we experience and psychological liberation? And if so, what what is that about? What do we need to go through? For instance, the well-known spiritist philosopher Leon Denis, who was in
Hmm.
the late 19th century, early 20th century, published several books about Spiritism, was a well-known interpreter of Spiritism. I remember in one of the books of his I read, he talks about the importance of suffering. And
And
part of,
that's in itself is quite controversial, right?
yeah,
Listen to what you just said, the
yeah.
importance of suffering. So go ahead, Peter.
And it's like, oh my goodness, no thank you, right? So the question would be this. Um, in order for us to grow spiritually or to learn, do we have to suffer? And what do we mean by that?
And
Well,
and also, sorry to interrupt you,
yeah,
Peter,
go
but
ahead.
also, like, if I can repeat your words, right? In order to evolve spiritually, do I need to suffer? But I
Right.
think there's a linkage, right? So
Mm,
again, just so we can keep the thread, because it's quite, in my opinion, obscure those threads, right? For
okay.
me to evolve, do I need to suffer?
Right.
But also the how it leapfrogs this uh, growth, spiritual growth into enlightenment and the so-called psychological liberation, right? So it's almost like the end in mind for this discussion is how do we get to that, psychologically speaking, that sense of freedom, and you get that through spiritual growth. And so it goes back to your question: do we need to suffer to get to that middle
Right.
ground?
Right. Well, first of all, is suffering, can we avoid suffering as we are
Mhm.
born into this world and we experience everything that we experience, whether it's the relationship we have with our bodies, the relationship we have with the people who are close to us, the families we grow up in, the families we may have on our own as adults, the both the personal and professional relationships we go through, financial challenges and everything else. So really struggle of one kind or another is unavoidable. But then
Correct.
one could ask, is there any benefit to it? Or is it just we're here to suffer or be
No, no.
well, I don't think that's the point either, right? Everything we go through is an opportunity to learn, which can be very positive. It may not be much fun while we're going through it, but it doesn't mean that everything is. This is a very pessimistic view, which I don't believe in. But
And
the
maybe, sorry, again,
yeah,
Peter, you as you're talking, there's thoughts, all sorts of thoughts that come to my mind.
mm,
But yes, pessimistic, right? But then there's also something there is underneath it all, which
mhm,
is the idea, and I don't know if you can explore, by the way, but the
right,
idea that suffering, there is a strong correlation between suffering and a physical existence, right? All of those things that you brought to us, which are very real, by the way. I
right,
don't mean by any means to dilute the suffering that we all may go through, financial hardships,
uh,
loss from a family member, a loved one, or difficulties, to include mental issues, right? Physical issues, and the material exists in itself, those responsibilities, the worries that we go through. So it's not that we're minimizing, but those are really highlighting the material component of our existence. In
Yeah.
addition to that, there is this whole spiritual dimension to our existence that also brings about that idea. And I think you're going to go discuss that, right, Peter? But this the whole idea that suffering also portrays that spiritual dimension that most of us are not even thinking about.
Yes. If, for instance, Saint Augustine in there's the Spiritist codification. Would you like
Hmm.
me to explain the Spiritist codification quickly, or I can?
You can, please.
Okay. Very quickly, the Spiritist codification is the 5 books that make up uh, the what Spiritism is, and it's a explanation of Spiritism's understanding about the nature of our existence. And it contains messages from spirits on the other side
Hmm.
that are often very philosophical, very inspirational, and very meaningful about the nature of our existence. And in the third book of the Spiritist codification, the Gospel according to Spiritism, there's a passage attributed to Saint Augustine. And Saint Augustine emphasizes that if we're going through something really difficult, rather than complain or lament about it,
Hmm.
see it as something to be happy about. And he's not saying we should be a masochist. What he's saying is
Correct.
if we get through this experience, this challenge, whatever it is, and we get through it and we know we can get through it, it is a victory.
Hmm.
Everything we experience that is remotely challenging for us can be a victory. Whether it's certain relationships we're in, whether it's certain goals that we have for our lives, certainly physical challenges, health related issues, and so forth. And this, I think, is connected to the passion of Jesus because, again, was there a kind of psychological liberation or emotional liberation as a result of going through that ordeal?
What do you think? What do you think? Was there a psychological liberation
Well, first of
from all
all,
that pain? Yeah.
I don't think any of us are being asked to go through that. So we
Oh,
do not have to, thank
thank
God.
goodness. Uh-huh.
Um, Rather, I think one of the important messages of the Passion is how do any of us stand up when people have betrayed us, when we have not been treated fairly? Because Jesus brings a message of love.
Yes.
Suppose he became angry and vindictive. These people don't appreciate me. They don't like me. Look what they're doing to me. I'm going to get even with them. Well,
Like
that's
like
not
we all do, right, Peter? Like we
right.
all do.
99.99% of us do.
Uh-huh.
The point, one of the major points of the Passion is that Jesus remained faithful to himself even when that happened
Yeah.
to him.
Yeah.
So, can any of us, when we go through things that are unfair, unjust, challenging, can we be can we maintain our equilibrium? Can we still be grounded? Can we still be compassionate towards
Mhm.
people?
Yeah.
The way any of us can be compassionate towards a small child, even when a small child misbehaves, because we know it's a small child. But do we have that same attitude with adults, with our fellow adults? Hmm, not so much. Or,
Yeah.
well, depends,
Can
right?
can I give an example, Peter?
Mhm.
I just I'm thinking as you say the example of a small child, which is an example of maternal or paternal love, right?
Yes, yes.
And I think this is beautiful because we kind of change the meaning of love. We really don't understand, and we corrupt, if you will, the meaning of love. But with that child, even when, as you said, that child is doing something maybe not good or break something, and we don't stop loving, and
Right.
yet we teach, right, and we move on from there as a teaching experience. And the one thing that came to my mind immediately as you said that, and there's a reason for that, but is the fact that if the example of if we were perhaps crossing the street, let's say, right,
Okay.
And there's maybe a lot of people, and somebody comes in and bam, hits us. What is the expected, right? Expected reaction. You crazy? Aren't you
Yeah.
watching? There was a, we all rushed. Can't you pay attention?
Right. Right.
Yet, if that person visibly was a, let's say, a blind person with a cane, and
Mhm.
you can see, and yes, they, same thing, bang into you immediately. What do we look into that situation? It's you that was not paying attention to, say, suffering of the other,
Right.
and allow the suffering of the other, the blindness, get to you and hurt you. And that in itself, Peter, I think is a great example, because
Mhm.
the idea is we all are suffering, right? I don't know if you're going to talk about this, but the reality is, in these billions of inhabitants in our planet today, we're talking about this year, right? 2023. Today, we are so many, in so many different states of life, either by gender, place of birth, educational access, professional, political, religious, whatever way of having access and status or success.
Right.
Yet, all of us, the common denominator is we all suffer.
Hmm.
If we all suffer, why don't we look at the other suffering like we would look to that blind person across the street? Just a thought. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the reasons is because I'd like to say most of us
Mm-hmm.
struggle with some variation of egocentric behavior.
You got it.
And
Yeah.
we go into the world that way. It's the child's
Mm-hmm.
right to be egocentric. It's what children are. But
Mm-hmm.
as through normal healthy development, we are supposed to become less egocentric as we reach adulthood. But do we? Well, to varying degrees, yes and no. Some are less, some rather egocentric well into adulthood. Depends, right? And going back to what you were saying, that example of say you're walking across the street and somebody boom hits you by surprise.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I was thinking is, have you had this experience where if you're caught by surprise in that kind of way, is the first impulse what? Anger, maybe? Because it's a funny thing, isn't it? If we're caught by surprise, it's like we're walking in the jungle or in the wilderness and under attack. The first thing that comes to us is that adrenaline rush to defend ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so maybe that's part of a normal animalistic impulse. But then, as you were getting at, the next step would be, can I begin to pull back from how I'm reacting to that situation and ask, what is the other person going through?
Right.
So if somebody's not fair to us, for instance, or attacks us, maybe verbally or some way, or is just not doesn't treat us well. Do we, once we maybe get over the initial hurt or anger we have, do we look at what they're going through and where they're coming from?
Mm-hmm.
It's not a way of excusing it necessarily, it depends on the circumstances. But are we capable of going there, that we're able to just have some idea of what people are doing?
Yeah, and I think Peter, just back to what you're saying previously, right? And the example here is the Passion of Jesus. And for those who have
Right.
not seen the movie, right? The movie is, I believe, focusing on the 12 hours, which are the Passion, right? If you go to anywhere in the world in a Catholic, let's say, cathedral, no matter where you are in the world, you
Mhm.
often will find the 12 steps, the 12 hours of the Passion, which is increasingly painful, right?
Right.
But we are talking here as an example. The what is it? tragedy, right? And it's there's so much pain, as you mentioned, but it also brings us, like, I'm gonna put myself as the person who's crossing the street and hitting the blind person. This case would be Jesus, let's say, right?
right.
What about my self-awareness about my own behavior, my own conduct, and the fact that I could indeed, if I'm not self aware, look at the suffering person, blindness in this case, and just go into a rant, right? We look about what the condemnation and
Hmm.
judgment and just
Right,
tirade of being angry at that person that crossed your path
right.
regardless of their stage in life. And then somebody or somehow I find out, oh my goodness, Peter, look at how crazy or silly or unaware I was by
Hmm.
letting my instinctive, right? You mentioned the reaction, that instinctive emotional response.
Right,
In this case, anger. It could be fear. Could be any trigger to that
hmm,
response of condemnation.
right,
That then after a review of our response, we get to a point to say, I really messed up, right? I really messed up. So, what happens to us afterwards? And in the case of Jesus, if you don't know, we can talk about perhaps Peter, right? One of his the rock behind the foundation of Christianity,
hmm,
but he denies Christ 3 times,
right.
right? Or
And
Judas, who sells him, right? And he then sells by getting money to identify the soldiers, the Romans, to say that's Jesus, get him now, and
right,
that leads to the entire suffering that comes through the passion of Christ.
right,
And what happens to him? His the sense of guilt and the sense of a completely being overwhelmed by this emotion led them to different types of response to their own guilt.
right.
But is that what Jesus wanted, by the way? Right?
I
Is that
think,
what? Yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
I think Jesus knew that was going to happen. I mean,
Yeah.
Jesus says to Peter, as you mentioned, "You will
Mm-hmm.
betray me 3 times by the time the crow cocks." And Peter's like, "No, I would never do that to you." And then
Uh-huh.
he does. And should we like condemn Peter for that? No. Peter was acting like a human being. He did what I think most of us would do. He he panicked.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the first time. There's the moments where he wants to heal people during the Gospels and he can't. And
Yeah.
Jesus points out they lack faith because they were still struggling with their own sense of who they are. And,
Mm-hmm.
uh, you know, they, and the thing about Peter versus Judas is Judas betrays Jesus. And of course, Judas kills himself and feels guilt and shame. But Peter mobilizes. He and all the other disciples are very demoralized when Jesus passes on the cross. But at the same time, when he comes back and gets them mobilized and they mobilize, they come back
Mm-hmm.
and they go to the second temple during the Pentecost. Uh, about 50 days after the Passion, they uh, receive the Holy Spirit, which Jesus told them was going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
The Last Supper, he tells them that. And what it demonstrates is that the disciples, even though they reacted the way they did during the Passion, which was they fled, and acted like they didn't know Jesus, they turned around, they regrouped, they found their faith, and
And
then
this
they
is the message, right, Peter? This is the message of psychological liberation.
yes,
Can you tell us perhaps what is the difference
mhm,
from Peter, right, who recognized with shame that, yes, Jesus, you're right.
Right.
You saw through me, and you even alerted me, and I failed you by denying you, and I'm ashamed. And I don't know if you remember, right? He cried and cried and cried over his own sense of shame and guilt. But Judas, instead, he held on to that guilt to the point that
Right.
it became overwhelming,
Right.
and he had to completely destroy himself because he could not face that guilt. So the question then becomes, if you go back to the idea of psychological freedom,
Right.
what do we need? What is the lesson that we have it here in front of us through the fact that we suffer, right? You mentioned that we all suffer,
Right.
regardless if it's through spiritual triggers or material triggers. We all are very much human in this connecting
Mhm.
point. That's what makes us all very much alike.
Right.
We all are going through some sort of pain or a
Mhm.
pain point that is easily, once it's triggered, it exacerbates. So
Right.
suffering, hopefully not like Jesus Christ in
Yes.
those 12 hours, but we all
Right.
do. We
Mhm.
cannot minimize the other
Mhm.
person's pain. and
Right.
and then the sense of guilt that we face after we also found, and I'm not talking about the Judas or Peter or anybody, but I'm talking about perhaps those soldiers, right? Those people during the trial of Jesus that think about it, Peter. He healed so many people, right? We
Right.
hear that he healed the lepers and those who were blind, those who could not walk, all of those that had a complete change of their lives.
Mhm.
Where were they? Why couldn't they come and say, no, he's not what you're saying, right? All of them disappeared. Yet, like you mentioned before, he went through all of that, I would say, indignation, unfairness with extreme sense of
Right.
balance,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
And acquiescence to whatever was going to go through to teach us indeed a lesson about our fortitude as human beings to withstand any type of pain, physical, emotional, right?
Right.
Or spiritual, and survive and do it well.
Right.
So, what can we talk about? Um, Maybe, Peter, in this sense of psychological liberation, what is it that you and I and everybody else here, what do we need to learn from this idea of discussing the movie, The Passion of the Christ, right?
I
And yeah, go ahead.
I would say one word,
Mm,
forgiveness.
yes.
Really, Christianity is about forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
And if imagine kind of go back to a thing I was talking about before.
Uh-huh.
Imagine if Jesus reacted with vindictiveness. Suppose he was angry. These people didn't love me the way they were supposed to, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
His entire message would have collapsed. It would have meant nothing
true.
because it's one thing to talk about love and compassion, love your neighbor, you must love God with all your heart, and your neighbor is yourself. But then we get put to the test. And can we get through the test? But the other part of that forgiveness is no, the apostles don't pass the test in that moment, so to speak. We
Yes,
condemn
yes.
them? No, not at all. Again, as mentioned before, they're behaving like human beings. It's like you were saying before, the minute the crow cocked and Peter realized he had betrayed Jesus 3 times, he just went, "Oh my God, I did. Look what I did." But how did he react? He regrouped. You know,
Mhm.
I like Peter because Peter's like the little engine that could. You know, he
Well, and he has a great name, right? Just kidding.
name it all.
Yeah.
He can fall flat on his face, and he's got the humility and the courage to get back up, learn the lessons as best he can. Doesn't mean he won't make mistakes later on, but he learns
Hmm.
the lessons and keep going. That does, Judas is another representation of that human side of us that
Yeah,
feels so ashamed and so horrified that we feel like the only choice we have is to
yeah,
take ourselves out.
yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
condemning Judas is I think misses the point too. Um, have I'm not. I think I've seen or haven't there been some places where they like burn an effigy of Judas as if he's like the most terrible.
It's
Uh,
yes, it's actually very common in the part of the country where I was born, which was
oh,
not in the
really?
US, was in
Okay.
Brazil. In the
Okay.
Northeast is it's very interesting, Peter, to go through, especially in small towns
Mhm,
where
mhm.
the main square and to date, right? We're talking about, oh my goodness, about 2000, almost 2000 years after the event,
Yeah.
and that hanging, the representation of hanging of Judas is I don't know, cathartic to those individuals who do it. I
Right.
don't understand. I just know that, let's say, if I were Judas' mother,
Mm, mm,
the
yes.
pain that you know is very real, right? The
Right.
pain of anyone who has suicide ideation, anyone who has lost a friend, a loved one, or a family member, right, close to us through suicide, it's something that marks them forever.
Absolutely.
But
Yeah.
in this case, the spirit, as we know, the immortal spirit that at that time was Judas,
Right.
he receives all of those vibrations of those people that are condemning. So again, that idea of condemnation, right? He feels that at that time, the spirit of Judas at the time, who could not, he was so overwhelmed by his own shame and sense of guilt. How does it feel that you just cannot forget? Because there's thousands and thousands and thousands of people globally
Right.
that take pleasure in killing him again. I don't know how does. Do you have any thoughts about it? The sense of how
Well, I was
guilt
just
plays.
wondering
Yeah.
if the message of these relivings of that, in
Mm.
these festivals, if it's about hating Judas,
What
that's
do you
one.
think?
Well,
Yeah.
I was thinking, is it about hating Judas or is it about reminding oneself of what happened there and the reaction he had? I must say, I'm not sure. Didn't, I haven't looked into this. I didn't grow up with these experiences.
Yeah.
But if it's about hating Judas, then again, there was a line in the Passion. Oh, forgive me. I think it's Luke. It's the
Mm.
one gospel that has the line, Father, forgive them. They know not what they're doing, which
Hmm.
Jesus says when he's on the cross.
Yes.
And it's such a resonant line because,
Yes.
excuse me, it says so much about how people often we don't know what we're doing.
Yeah.
We think we know what we're doing, but we don't.
What is the
And
trigger, right? What is the trigger behind my and when I say this, I have this vision of those who inflict pain, but we can actually extrapolate the sense of judgment and
yes,
condemnation and just I'm going to quote unquote kill
mhm,
this, right,
right,
for whatever reason, and
right,
yet we rationalize, right?
mhm,
Because if you think about it, there are theaters of war today in our society.
Hmm.
There are many, many areas of conflict. And what I mean by that are warring nations, or even within one nation, warring factor sections of, of communities that are killing each other,
Okay.
right? And but they're rationalizing the killing for whatever reason.
Right.
And so if we take away that political context or historical context and bring to us what, this is a moment of reflection, what entitled us to have such strong condemnation? And Peter, don't we do that sometimes, even in the most innocent time? I don't know. I wake up in the middle of the night, it's 3 in the morning. I grab my phone and I scroll in whatever social media platform du jour, and I look and I say, "What? What?" And I'm kind of delusional. It's 3 in the morning, and I go and I pour out this terrible reaction and opinion, and of
Mm.
course in this guise of anonymity, or the great numbers of, this doesn't matter, it's just a word, it's just a mobile device, I can say
Yeah.
whatever. But
Right.
aren't we expressing through this small act exactly what in other contexts are the same types of hurt and all that aggression that still reside in us as primitive, still humans or beings that we are?
Yeah. The desire for retribution is a very deep current.
Yeah,
I think we all have.
yeah, yeah,
We'd like to
yeah,
think that we don't, of course.
yeah.
If we are doing our best to understand the message of Jesus, then we're trying to
Hmm.
free ourselves from those kinds of impulses.
Yeah,
So again, psychological liberation is really about the ability to forgive. The ability to forgive is about letting go
yeah.
and not, my group is right, that group is wrong.
Yeah,
Because
my
when
clique, right? My club, my whatever sports club is the one that is better. Because, by the way, there is a reason behind. I need to have a feeling of belonging, right?
yeah,
And so I'm going to protect that family, that clique, that club that is mine against the others. But it's very interesting if we move away from the conversation to something very positive. I think you alluded before, Peter, in terms of Jesus' passion, but also if we think about what preceded the passion, which is an entire life, right? An entire life
yes.
demonstrating evidence in being an evidence of growth
Hmm.
and a sense of perhaps of dignity, right? And how he uh, was bringing to us. I You started this conversation with the idea that we all get crazy and we're so stressed and we all are suffering for A, B, C, or D. And
Right.
yet, I don't know that we ever saw Jesus worrying about if he had enough money to go to haha McDonald's to get a supersized meal. Well, I'm just kidding here, but instead he lived those lives
Mhm.
regardless of how he was born, because remember, he was not born in wealth. On the
Correct.
contrary,
Right.
the symbolism of his birth is one that he had nothing, literally nothing. And
Right.
yet he demonstrated throughout his life this a life of complete balance and this freedom that we're talking about it. So from that perspective, if we think about that, he perhaps exemplified joy, right? And in every action, every event. And so if we talk about joy, we can say, but Peter, what is joy, right? What is joy? Is it happiness? Is it it is, we know, a basic human emotion, one of the four basic emotion. But what is it? What triggers that joy that I perhaps assume that Jesus had a life of? And I'm reminded through the teachings of Spiritism of the notion of a deliberately planned existence, the goals for this existence, right? It is one that we, most of us
Mhm.
as spirits, were part of it. And
Right.
we said, oh, during this next existence, I am going to learn.
Hmm.
And in order for me to learn, I'm going to go through this. And in order to go through this, I potentially may suffer. So, from that perspective, joy, while constant is his message, he never said, my children, you will not suffer, right? You
Right.
will not go through struggles. You will not shed any tears for anything. He didn't say that, but what
He
he
said the
brought was,
opposite times.
yes,
Kind of
yes, right?
to
He
them, but
said you're strong enough to overcome all of it. And I think because we're coming close to our time together, but he brought this notion of joy, of optimism, of plenitude. And plenitude is a word that Joanna de Angelis brings a lot throughout
yes,
her work, and
right.
it simply just means full, a sense of
A sense of fullness
completeness.
from within, right?
Yes, yes.
Hmm.
So, what can we say as a conclusion about this discussion on psychological liberation, even or despite extreme cases of suffering?
Okay. One thing I did want to stress that I was thinking about before,
Hmm.
when we talk about suffering, this should not be confused with some kind of masochism because,
Yes, thank
going
you.
back to the Passion of Jesus, it's the message is we must all be a bunch of masochists in order to be spiritually liberated.
Uh-huh.
Well, I'm not going to try to get into that one deeply, but I don't think that's the point. I think rather if we just go through whatever challenges any of us have in our daily lives, if we can do our best to get through them, whatever they are, that is a big victory. And in terms of having that plenitude, that fullness of self, do we have the strength within ourselves to go through whatever we need to go through and face it to the best of our ability?
Hmm.
Can we be compassionate with ourselves as we go through that process? Meaning, sometimes we're going to get frustrated, sometimes we're going to fall short, sometimes
Hmm.
we judge ourselves or we judge others and so forth. But can we release that, again, forgiveness, and be able to really um, stay truthful to our higher selves,
Yes.
even when we're challenged? And that's certainly, I think, one of the messages that Jesus is showing us through the passion, really everything. And certainly one of the messages he was telling the apostles, the disciples, that you guys are not going to have an easy time of it. That's essentially what he was telling them at times. And they may not have fully understood, but by the time they're ready to continue, from in Acts of the Apostles, for instance, they've reached a point where they're ready to
Yeah.
take
Yeah.
the torch and go with it. And Joanna de Angelis also says something I think that's very important. Well, this is in chapter 6 of the book Conscious Being.
Hmm.
The disciples, the apostles, did not hate their executioners. You
Hmm.
know, it's, most of them died a violent death. I think only one died in old age,
Correct.
but the others were all persecuted. They did not, and her point was they had an idea of what they were doing. They
Hmm.
they were willing to take that on, and when the moment finally happened, they weren't vindictive about it.
Yeah, and can I say something real quickly? Because you bring about a very good point here, which is the notion of once they not just knew rationally, but they had completely internalized
Yeah,
that consciousness of their own immortality,
very good point.
right?
Yes.
They knew at that point that the ceasing of this life
Mhm.
in this corporeal body here,
Right.
it's not your real life. They really knew that. Therefore, their cessation of life through those terrible acts of martyrdom
Yeah.
did not pose a problem, right?
Because this is
Uh,
part of what it means to have faith.
yes,
Big
yes.
part of what it means to have faith, right?
But let's go back to what I was saying earlier. Remember, I said there's 3 points:
Mm-hmm.
spiritual growth, the
Mm-hmm.
second, the middle point, which is suffering, and the
Mm-hmm.
third point is that actually it starts with the spiritual growth. I'm sorry, with suffering,
Okay.
spiritual growth that
Mm-hmm.
leads to that psychological liberation.
Mm-hmm.
And the what we need to get to that spiritual growth may require suffering so that we can look at ourselves just like Peter did. And remember what you said, after he faced with his feet the shame and the fear and the guilt, he turned around and
Right.
became Peter that we know,
Peter,
right? The
the Peter,
the Peter.
the
And it's
man.
amazing. Yeah, it's amazing what he
Yeah.
was able to do
Right.
through that step of looking square in the eyes of your own soul, of your own guilt, of your own shame, and then you
Right.
turn around. And that was it. In the case of, and I'm going to piggyback on what you're saying, yes, there were 12 apostles, and yes, one out of the 12 did not have a violent death. Who was it? John the Evangelist. And John the Evangelist lived a life of love, right? He's portrayed over and over again, but this just love. And even when he went to the island, I think of it, Patmos, right, where he
Mm-hmm.
was on exile for many years. There's accounts of interesting accounts where he
Mm-hmm.
was sent to die and he couldn't die. He was just love. He never once said, I'm an exile and this is a terrible experience.
Right.
No, he loved. He was in an essence of love in every day, in every form, in every way. So for that matter, he had reached his own spiritual growth and his own liberation.
Right.
So I think this is a good way for us to perhaps end here with this idea that it's not a correlation. No, it's not a causation. It's a correlation between
Mm-hmm.
suffering and spiritual growth. The causation is whatever is the trigger to bring that awareness of our own inner self, right? Through self-discovery, inner transformation, suffering or not. Go ahead, Peter.
Well, faith that we will have that inner discovery, that we have the capacity for it. But I was
Yes.
also thinking, as you were talking about John, about the importance of loving
Yeah.
humanity unconditionally.
Yes.
That I know we need to wind up, and that's a big subject unto itself because there's different aspects of love, so to speak.
Yeah.
We're not necessarily going to love our bitterest enemies the same way we're going to love a family member, but
Yeah. I hope
really,
not, right?
right,
Actually.
but loving unconditionally is more about, again, forgiving people and not hanging on to some kind of anger, animosity, desire for retribution, in which it only harms us in the long run. The more we stay angry at the world, the more my group's better than that group.
Yeah.
Then we're hanging on to something that's going to take its toll on us.
Yes.
And there's another area that Joanna de Angelis talks about the emotional effects on the physical, which are very, very important. And
Uh,
that kind of anger and hatred is that sort of thing that can bring that about.
Yeah, I love that. Maybe we can come back and talk a little bit more about it, Peter,
Yeah.
at a different time. I just want to say thank you for being here. Thank you
Thank you.
for bringing that really rather complex set of points and counterpoint through suffering all the way to joy and optimism and strength, right? Strength and love all the way through this life of happiness and enlightenment. But with that, I'll see you next time in our next episode. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.